Hello and welcome to Africa Trade Brief. Today we take a look at the East African nation that Standard Chartered in 2019 described as one of the top 20 rising stars of trade. So let's start with that Standard Chartered accolade which was given last year alongside the likes of Cote d'Ivoire on our continent. Emerging and developed markets in Asia, Africa and the Middle East ranked highly. Cote d'Ivoire at number 1, India at number 2 and Kenya at number 3, one of the top 3 rising stars in trade. The bank says Kenya is one of the markets that has progressed its trade growth potential the most in the last decade. Let's take a closer look then at what's been happening in Kenya. The next table will show us the top trading partners of Kenya in terms of sales exports. Let's take a look at who they are. The top trading partner there in terms of exports, the United Kingdom, followed by Uganda, the Netherlands, Tanzania, United States, Egypt, Pakistan, Somalia, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Of course, these graphics are from 2019 as we wait for more data that's going to come in from 2020. We know that's normally done annually. Kenya's major exports, you can see here, Uganda 8.2% on the continent, Tanzania and Egypt as well. South Africa there at only 2.6%, slightly less than the Democratic Republic of Congo at 3.0%. When we leave the continent, we see that the Netherlands and the United Kingdom's very large trading partners, remember this is from 2019, 7.5% for the Netherlands, 6.7% for the United Kingdom, and we see the United States at 8.7%. Let's take a look then at Kenya's trading partners in terms of imports. We see China at 23% and India at 9.8%. We see that large number of imports that are coming in from China, which has been raised as a problem. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. United Arab Emirates, 7.4% of Kenya's major imports. Japan, 4.6%. And we're trying to see South Africa, 4.5% of imports that are coming into Kenya. Uganda, which is much closer, only 2.3%. Another East African nation, 1.4%, Tanzania, in terms of imports then. Let's see how Kenya interacts with the largest economies in the world. But also, of course, these are the major imports that come in. You can see the United Arab Emirates at 17.7% there and Germany at 3.16%. But let's go now to take a look at how they interact with the major economies in the world. This is AGOA, obviously an agreement between the United States and lots of countries in Kenya. The goods exported from Sub-Saharan Africa on the right, the European Union, United States, Sub-Saharan Africa, China and India. The Kenya National African Growth and Opportunity Act strategy, which the United States speaks about, was quite a focus last year. It provides strategies and actions for increasing export to the United States. The overall approach of that strategy, and I'm quoting from the AGOA website there, offers multiple actions in areas ranging from expanding U.S. market share and biodiversification to trade facilitation, skills development, increasing productivity, trade support, capacity building, and more. Right, let's go. Let's take a look at the world's second largest economy, China, and how they interact with Kenya now when it comes to their trade. If we can bring up the next graphic on the screen to take a look at what's happening there. Perhaps we don't have that, and we'll get a little bit more on that a little bit later on. Those figures, as I've said, are from 2019. Perhaps best qualified to give us insight into what's happening in terms of trade in Kenya now is their cabinet secretary, what we would call in South Africa a minister, Betty Maina. I spoke to her a little bit earlier on. Let's take a look. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. Can you give us any figures or give us insight into how trade in Kenya has been affected by COVID-19, especially in light of your recent lockdown?
Thank you very much. I think the whole world has been really negatively affected by COVID, and many businesses have had to shut down, maybe as a result of the restriction measures, and you know, there've been very many different. The hospitality sector, for instance, has had a really big challenge, and overall, the Kenyan economy, like other economies, we were expecting about 6.2% growth at the beginning of 2020, but by the end of 2020, we're now working at 0.6 growth. So it's bad. But I'm, of course, aware that there are many other economies that actually went into negative during this period. So we've seen a great reduction in our growth, and therefore, which also affected our national revenues. I am quite glad, however, that the restriction measures that we put in place, though they've affected the economy, somehow we haven't actually lost as many lives, and we are grateful to God for that.
Right. 2 months into the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, what has the experience been like for Kenya, and when can we expect to start seeing perhaps data on the impact of that agreement?
Well, governments collect data on an annual basis. I mean, there be some quarterly, but obviously on an annual basis. So we don't expect to see major data come in before the end of the year. We're excited about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the fact that many countries have ratified it. Some of the negotiations will be completed by the end of June this year, and then we move on to negotiations in services. So I think these are early days yet. I don't think that we should really expect any numbers for a while.
Okay. Let's move away from perhaps the continent's agreements and look beyond our borders. Let's look at trade between Kenya, the United States, and the United Kingdom, as well as China. What's the state of those 3 large economies' trade with Kenya?
The UK is our 5th largest market. Also, the US is also not very far from that in terms of exports of goods from Kenya. Of course, in terms of imports, we are not their largest trading partners by any dint of imagination. China is a source of a lot of imports from especially raw materials as well as capital goods and finished goods into Kenya. So when we look at our trade balances, there's obviously quite a lot that comes from China. But for us, in terms of export destination, the UK and the US are fairly significant players outside the East African region.
Okay. When we speak of free trade areas and agreements, it can sometimes feel very high level. Can you explain to our viewers why ultimately these agreements that you have, not only on the continent, but with partners outside, like you've just spoken about, will ultimately benefit them, whether in Kenya, South Africa, or across the continent?
Okay. Trade agreements provide certainty for investors, certainty for exporters that the regime that is available is predictable, is rule-based, and clear. Therefore, when Kenya pursues a trade agreement within Africa, for instance, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is really about expansion of markets for producers within the continent, which is also an attraction of investors once they are certain that there is a large market. We signed on to the East African Community Agreement about 20 years ago. And what that did is that it attracted investors in the region because they knew that they were certain about this market of 160 million people. That's the same thing with Africa. It provides a market of 1 billion plus. And therefore, when Kenya enters into negotiations with the United Kingdom, it is for certainty of access into that market. It's also for certainty of investment. The other thing that trade agreements do is that you don't just negotiate market access. There are also additional matters like trade capacity building. So that gives us an impetus as a country to focus on building up our capacity to trade. And once you've got greater capacity to trade, once you've got greater investment, it's not just for those markets alone, it is for all markets. So it also acts as a pool for smallholders, for small and medium enterprises to enter into these markets with certainty.
Thank you very much for your time on SABC News this afternoon. Right, let's take a look at how African markets and currencies are performing now. Right, we've been showing you visuals in that corner of the screen there of the protest at the University of Johannesburg Kingsway campus. Reports that police may be firing water cannons, or there's a standoff of some sort between law enforcement and students. Of course, we'll be bringing you more news about those protests. Our reporter Griselda Lewis on the scene. My colleague Mpora simply standing by with you with the details shortly. And Nompumelelo Siziba coming up at the top of the hour with more news for you. Good afternoon from me.